Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be talking a bit about exposure and specifically about shutter speed. So to start off, I think it probably would be a good idea to tell you a little bit about what is an exposure. Maybe take that for granted that we know what an exposure means. An exposure, what it means is you have a light-sensitive material, and the photographer then chooses the manner in which the light-sensitive material is exposed to light through the camera. It's not an arbitrary choice. We can control the nature of the way that light is hitting it. We can blast that light-sensitive material with high intensity of light for a very short amount of time. We can hit the surface with a very low intensity of light for a very long period of time. We can ramp up the sensitivity of that light-sensitive material, and that will affect how the exposure goes. In this particular experiment, we're going to be working with shutter speed. And shutter speed relates to time, the amount of time that we are allowing the light-sensitive material to be exposed to light. Now, this is not an arbitrary choice. This is actually going to be based on a lot of different factors. There's a big difference between making an image that is shot at 1/500th of a second versus something that might be shot at half a second. Now, it's hard to really contextualize what does that mean. Really kind of think, what does a 500th of a second look like? Or what does a half a second look like? We don't really experience the world that way. So these two sort of polar ends there are outside of our visual experience. So as a photographer, when we're thinking about shutter speed, it's helpful if instead of thinking about it as just a mathematical number, if we think about shutter speed as a visual experience. What kind of visual experience are we wanting to give the viewer? So when we're working with the shutter speed, we're going to be working with a variety of them using the same lighting scenario. And what that's going to do is it's going to offer us some information as to what different shutter speeds, what different exposure times offer us aesthetically. But it's also going to tell us a little bit more information. It's going to tell us at what point do we ourselves, the photographer, need to stabilize the camera. Because at some point, this exposure is not going to be short enough. We're not going to be able to hold the camera steady for that duration. And I'll talk more about that when I get to the table there and explain what the project is all about. So with this first experiment, which I call to hold or not to hold, we will be exploring shutter speed. So like all of our experiments, it's going to start off with composition. This course, which is creative lighting, is all about getting to know how light reacts on objects and how to expose those things given our own visual voice. So with this experiment, to hold or not to hold, it starts off with the composition, with setting up the set, with lighting the set, and creating a situation that we can use for the shutter speed experiment. So if we look at what I have here, I've set up a scenario. I'll go ahead and turn this one off. I've set up a scenario with some objects just sort of laid out here that I can actually explore using the camera itself, because unlike some of the other experiments that we work on, this one will be off of a tripod. We're not going to be sitting it down on the table or putting it on any kind of support. We're going to be holding the camera. So it gives us a lot of freedom of movement, but you'll also discover that there's some limitations to that if we were attempting to not have evidence of movement in our image. So I started off here with the key light. It is set to give me a short lighting scenario on these bones here. I've also diffused it so that the shadows would not be quite so hard. At the same time, I decided to go ahead and increase or decrease the distance of the shadows over here by adding a very light fill light over on the other side at a 1:10 ratio. So this one is set at 100%, this one is set down to 10%, and I've even got the baffles shut to give me just a very narrow beam. What I'm attempting to do there is to create a small highlight, specular highlight almost, in the shadow area. Not to fill the shadow areas, but just to kind of give them a bit of a glow. So we start off with that. I don't even have the camera there. I kind of begin by organizing the table. You'll do the same thing. You don't have to use this scenario that I've set up. You'll choose your own to start off. Then we'll move to setting up the camera. We'll have some very particular settings on the camera that you're going to start to work with, and then you'll progress through them as you go. So in order to take control of the shutter in our exposure, we want to set the camera on a particular shooting mode. Now, at the beginning of the semester, we talked a little bit about a dial that looks like kind of like this. And I highlighted just a few of those icons that are on there, namely the P, the T, the A, and the M. Sometimes this T is an S. Those are the settings that we most oftentimes use. P is for program, T would be for time, S is sometimes the icon, it stands for shutter, those are the same things. A is for aperture, and M would be for manual. So if we want to control the shutter speed and allow the camera to be able to compensate for all of the others, we would set the camera to the T value as I have it right here. Now, as we take a look at the settings on the other side, I'll just kind of scooch this over a little bit here. We take a look at the settings on this other side, you will see that I have several different numbers going on here. The first number right here is, in fact, the shutter speed. That represents how long the shutter stays open during the exposure. You'll see that it is represented right now by the number 1 with like a quote next to it. The quotes stand for or represent 1 second. When you see those quotes, it means it's a second. So this would be 1 second, which is actually, in photography world, kind of a long exposure. Next to that number, you'll see another number, and that stands for the aperture, or the size of the hole that is the light is able to pass through. Now, we'll talk about in another video just exactly what those numbers mean and how to adjust those. We also have the ISO, which is the sensitivity, to set to 200. We've locked that in. So instead of putting it on auto, we've locked it into 200. So now the camera will compensate using the aperture or the size of the hole depending on what shutter speed we choose. And so I'll demonstrate. As I start to turn the dial, you'll see the number 1 change. I'll turn the dial this way, 1, 2, 3 steps. And you see it change from the 1 second to something that now reads 0 seconds 5, which means half a second. Your camera might have a 1 / like a half symbol, but it means the same thing, of course. So note that I clicked 3 times to get there. So I'm back to 1, I go 1, 2, 3, and I've gotten to half a second. So I basically made the exposure half as long. So it was 1 second, now it's half a second. Why do we have 3 clicks to get there? It's just options, so that you have the options to go in between those. When I'm teaching the shutter speeds, I like to keep you on the whole shutters, and I start with the number 1, so it kind of helps you to understand where to go from there. You would go to 1, then you would go to half a second, and a quarter of a second, an eighth of a second, and so on. So I will click over 3 more steps in the direction, 1, 2, 3, and now I have the number 4. So with my camera, now I am in fractions of a second. It's a little quirky, but it's something that I got used to. So 4 represents a quarter of a second. Now I want you to pay attention to what has been going on to the numbers next to it, the apertures. They have been changing as I have been dialing the shutter speeds. So as I move this further, 1, 2, 3, you see that that aperture number had changed. It went from number 7 to a number 5. The number is getting smaller. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about aperture specifically in another project, another video. However, it's important to understand maybe right now that what's happening is the camera is compensating. The camera is allowing more and more light to come through as I shorten the duration of the exposure. So as I make the exposure shorter, the camera is opening up the lens more and more in order to continue to make a correct exposure. If it didn't do that, what would happen is the exposure or the picture would get darker and darker, because as I was cutting the time in half, if no other adjustment was made, it would just be less time, which would mean the picture would look dark. So as I continue on, 1, 2, 3, at a 15th of a second now, which is starting to get into where people can hold the camera steady. Most people can hold the camera steady at a 30th of a second, and you can see now we have 2.8. For my lens that I have on the camera right now, that's as wide open as it can possibly get. 2.8 is as wide open as it can get. Now again, I'm not going to get into the details of why the numbers are getting smaller, yet the hole is getting bigger. We'll talk about that later. But suffice it to say, the hole has gotten bigger, and now it is at the maximum size. It cannot get any bigger now. So as I continue now to try to push the shutter speed, you will see what the camera tells me. 1, 2, 3. Note now it is blinking at me. It's saying, hey, wait, I can't compensate anymore. In other words, it's saying this picture is probably going to not be what you expect it to be. So that blinking tells me something is off. Now, I do have some options here. I could go into the ISO and make the chip more sensitive. That would probably help, but we don't really want to do that. We're going to avoid that. What I can do, however, is make the light more intensive. I can bring the light in, I can turn the light brighter in order to get that to have more light, and therefore it will make a proper exposure. So in this experiment, you might find yourself having to adjust your lights a little bit in order to get an exposure, a correct exposure. So that is basically what we want to talk about. You're going to be using 3 different shutter speeds in the experiment. One would be considered a relatively fast shutter speed. All of you should be able to hold the camera very steady in your hands and use that shutter speed with no camera movement. The next one will be a medium shutter speed. Most of you will be able to hold the camera steady. Some of you may get a little bit of shake to the camera. Now remember, your objects aren't moving, so if you have camera movement, it's going to be you. So this is really more about your ability to hold the camera steady. The last shutter speed we're going to use is definitely going to be too long for just about any of you to hold steady. So what you'll end up doing is you're going to have to figure out how aesthetically how you can make a image that has built-in camera shake or movement, make that work. And so that will be one of the challenges that you have moving forward. Some of you are going to have multiple choices when it comes to your lens. As I demonstrated earlier in this semester, There are different types of lenses that can go onto your camera, and many of you have what is called multiple focal length lenses. Remember, I said let's get away from talking about them as zoom lenses. Let's talk about them more as multifocal length lenses. So many of you have what is a multifocal length lens. In other words, you have different choices of the angle to which you can expose, or I'm sorry, allow light to come through the camera. So what I want you to do is to go ahead and choose one of them by selecting it on the lens itself, and to go through the process of this experiment using that focal length alone, going through all the different shutter speed settings just for that. Then go ahead and reset the lens to a different focal length, and then do the experiment through again. Do the shutter speeds once more with that focal length, and then maybe do it a third time if you have those kinds of options. What you're going to see is different results based on the variety of focal lengths. You'll get different conclusions as to when you can hold the camera, how long you can hold it steady, and so on. So when we begin to shoot, we come over to the set, and the first thing that I want you to pay attention to is the idea that we are not going to be making pictures of bones. Just like in the previous exercises in this course, we were not making images of bottles. What we are doing is we are using the material to compose. We are using the material to affect, to bend, to create shadows, to create highlights, and so on. So the idea here is not to just observe the bones and show your viewer what bones look like, but to use the bones or to use the objects in order to make a composition that is dynamic, that communicates something that you're interested in communicating. So the idea is to get right in there and make your compositions as dynamic as you possibly can. You'll be changing the focal length, not the focal length, the focus of your light, of your image. You can explore a variety of compositions. You'll be moving up, you'll be moving down. You can move around the composition. You can shift the focus from one place to another in order to make the compositions. Now, I want you to notice that I am looking at my viewfinder here instead of through the actual, I'm looking at the screen rather than the viewfinder here. I prefer to look through the viewfinder when I'm shooting. That's my personal choice. To me, what it does is it gives me more of a feeling, it gives me more of a sense that I'm looking directly at the thing, that I'm more of an active participant in the image making. It also gives me a sense that I am closer to what I am doing and I can concentrate. When I have the camera out here, what it does is to me, it makes it seem more passive. Now, of course, when we're shooting video, we do keep it out there. Now, the reason I have this here is because I'm recording on this camera so that I can use it for the video that you're watching right now. As I'm doing that, you can see I'm shaking all over the place. So here is some of the compositions. Now you can move around the composition and get a variety of different perspectives. Again, what we're doing is we're using the set that you created in order to create a variety of compositions. You are then running through the various shutter speeds that I have on our project brief in order to explore what happens when you shoot at shutter speed A versus shutter speed B versus shutter speed C. What happens when you go from a very fast shutter speed that slices off a very thin amount of time to a very slow shutter speed, or something that carves out a very long period of time? At what point can you no longer hold the camera steady? Is there a point? It may be different for each of you. As I said, once you are exploring all of that, you will then create a second set, maybe break this down, create another set altogether, move the lights around, do the whole thing over just to get some variety, and then run through that once more, perhaps at another focal length on your camera. what is this all about? These experiments really are about introducing some of the techniques and some of the principles of photography, but they're also to introduce you to your camera, to the variety of functions, step by step and progressively. So, as we're moving forward, it's important that, that you sort of take your time, that when we're talking about breaking the set down, that you kind of clear the set, you turn all the lights off, you start back over, you put one key light out, you rotate it around, you figure out what position on the compass you want it for new. Wiping the slate clean is very important. It's kind of like starting over with a new painting canvas, rather than starting off with a canvas that you've been painting on for 2 hours and then trying to build on it again. So make sure that you're doing that. It's a little bit of time that it takes to break down and then reset it back up again. But what it does is kind of refreshes the whole scenario for you when you're working. So that is basically to hold, to not to hold. And the next couple of projects will explore some of the other components of exposure.